Aquí
and good morning, one and all.
nuestro panel que
We
lleva por
are
nombre Mujeres, Seguridad y
inaugurating
Mediación
the
en
panel
América Latina,
discussion
propuestas
entitled
alternativas para la
Women
construcción de
and
paz.
Security in Latin
Estamos en
America,
el cuarto Congreso de
Alternative
Construcción de Paz en
Proposals for
Perspectiva de
Peace
Género,
Building
5
in
de
the framework of
noviembre. Este
this
conversatorio
international
ha sido organizado
conference.
por las
This
colegas del
panel
Instituto
discussion
Catalán
has been organized
Internacional
by
por la
our
Paz,
colleagues
ICIP,
of the
y
Catalan
tendremos el
Institute for
gusto
Peace,
de tener como
ISIP.
moderadora
We have
a
the
Sandra
pleasure
Martínez
to have
Domingo.
Sandra Martínez
Ella es
Domingo as
coordinadora
a
del programa
facilitator.
Alternativas
She
de
is the
Seguridad
coordinator
del
of the
ICIP.
program Security
Y
Alternatives
brevemente
led
para
by
presentarla,
ISIP. Let me briefly
puedo decir
introduce
que
her.
ella coordina la línea de trabajo
Sandra
Alternativas de Seguridad, como
coordinates
ya mencioné, y desde esta área de trabajo se apuesta
work
por
line
promover los
on
fundamentos teóricos y prácticos del
safety
feminismo y la no
alternative
violencia.
based on
Sandra es
practical basis
criminóloga
of
por la Universidad de
feminism. She is
Barcelona,
a
con máster en
criminologist
transformación de
by the University of
conflictos y máster
Barcelona, and she
en derechos
hosts a
humanos,
master
democracia y
in human
globalización.
rights,
Actualmente
democracy,
finaliza sus
and
estudios en educación
globalization.
social.
Now she is
Bienvenida Sandra,
also enrolled
bienvenidas
in social
compañeras, y bueno, pues va a ser
education
una delicia este conversatorio
studies.
con todas ustedes.
Welcome to one and all, and it's going to be an amazing panel discussion for sure, for sure. Thank you very much, Elvia, and thank you very much, Ibero, for your kind presentation and for the excellent organization of the conference and the Congress. A few minutes ago, before being here online, we were discussing about the fourth edition of the conference, which is becoming quite of a referent both in Latin America and at the global scale. We're very pleased to have the possibility to share thoughts. Before framing the topic this morning, let me kindly remind you that you can ask questions in the YouTube channel, and in the last half an hour, we'll have room for Q&A. As Elvia was mentioning before, I work in ISIP, the Catalan International Institute for Peace. ISIP is a research organization and also a dissemination organization with the main aim of promoting peace culture both at the Catalan level and at the international level. And this has led us to pay attention to the safety model, the mainstreamed safety model, an hegemonic model that stems from a notion that is extremely based on national security and public order. And at the same time, it undermines human needs and it does not pay attention to differential impact of violence. Now, regarding current strategies, they are basically based on punishment logics and armed response. Such strategies become inefficient because they don't respond to the root causes of the conflict and don't solve them. So paradoxically, they end up reinforcing the culture of violence that they aim to solve. And that's why the main goal of ISIP, as Elvia was before mentioning, has to do with building an alternative narrative to the mainstream narrative. That means promoting new reflections and actions to tackle conflict from the theoretical concepts emanating from non-violence feminisms. So here's the theoretical framework. Today, this morning, there's 5 women, 5 of us, and we are also colleagues in a path that started a few months ago, and we're learning one from another in the framework of the project called Alternatives for Women regarding safety challenges in Latin America. This project is led by CPAZ, an organization based in Colombia, and today we have Jose Emilia Salamanca, a representative of the organization. Jose Emilia is a public policy and alliances advisor. We have also Laura Henao. She is the coordinator of a social conflict mediation of the Research and Popular Institute. And from Mexico, we have Jorge Castillo Osorio. She's the Mexico coordinator of Justice South America, and Elsa Pierre. She's the coordinator of the Safety and Protection area of CPAZ. As you can see, the project is a melting pot between Mexico, Colombia, and Catalonia. Even though we are all part of the project, not all the members of the project are here with us today. Having said that, Rosa Emilia will now tell us a little bit more about the project, and perhaps we can dig in. To start with, Rosa Emilia, tell us, what is the project about? How would you summarize it in a nutshell? Well, if I had to be brief, as I have been asked, I would say that the project aims at combining efforts in different countries to enhance debate on the topic of women, peace, and security in Latin America, which is a broad and important agenda all around the world, and that has been now marked on October the 30th, precisely, in the framework of the 13/20 resolution of the UN Security Council, and we want to boost this resolution in Colombia, in Mexico, and in Catalonia, and we want to broaden the scope of the resolution, and we want to ground it. We want to ground it in each context, right? So this would be a short definition and a short explanation of the project that brings us here. Thank you. Sandra Martinez speaking now. So, of course, it's a long-lasting process. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the project started? Sure. Listen, Sandra, I believe that this project was somehow developed first of all in Colombia for a reason. The Colombian experience, in particular regarding women experience in Colombia, has been harsh. I'm not denying the suffering in other parts of the world, but there's no doubt that Colombia is the origin of the project. So, having in or bearing in mind the context of the peace agreement in the framework of the Colombian conflict, it's been now years that we have been working to enhance the agenda on women, peace, and security in Colombia. So we have been active in the debate for a long time now, and we have had the possibility to engage with women from different parts of the world in a very local and global debate. And we've learned a great deal from this debate. And in this sense, I would like to say that we have carried out a very specific interpretation of the armed conflict in Colombia and the impact of the armed conflict on women in Colombia, both in terms of their everyday life and in terms of the impact on their bodies. In the case of Colombia, there has been a very important number of victims, of women victims of the armed conflict. And at the same time, we are 100% aware that our political conflict is quite specific in nature, because even though it has, of course, a political dimension, it also has ramifications in other forms of conflict that are perhaps less known or less visible. So we started trying to understand that the focus of the agenda on women, peace, and security in Latin America had to be reshaped, because the focus was a very classic focus, a very classic scope, and we didn't find enough room for us. We wanted a broader scope. So this agenda focuses perhaps a lot on peace and not so much on the area of security. And for us, it is very important to pay a lot of attention on the topic of security to contribute to enhancing peace processes, right? And in this sense, we brought on board topics such as mediation and many others. And that's how we started opening a debate with other countries. To be more specific, I had a very interesting experience in the framework of the agenda. For example, in the Middle East, in the framework of the agenda, a lot was being said about radical extremism in the Middle East. And I kept asking myself, how can we interact with these women in this part of the world? Where is the nexus between them and us? beyond being victims? What is the political agency that will unite us? And we started discussing about extreme violence in Latin America, because in Latin America there is extreme violence against women in many regions, and we were impressed by the statistics on women victims and assassinations in Latin America. So we started telling ourselves we need to take a different perspective on the agenda. So we've always thought that there's a country that we believe to be like a brother country, which is Mexico. And that's why we came to the conclusion that it would be extremely interesting to open a discussion with Mexico, with Mexican women, and also bringing on board perspectives from different parts of the world. And in this sense, we already had a relationship with IZIP. IZIP works in the area of peace and security, and that's how we started working this path and opening up this debate, this international debate. And this is a little bit the story of our project, and that's why our search of developing alliances and partnerships with Mexico has been amazing. When it comes to our relationship with Catalonia, with you guys, that we've had also the possibility to interact, to open discussions, and to adopting other perspectives. Thank you very much, Rosa Emilia. I believe that you've mentioned several occasions this dilemma between safety and peace, because other times they are presented as opposite concepts. I believe that in the framework of this project, it would be interesting to know a little bit more about what's the meeting point between security and peace building. In the case of Colombia, safety is tricky, and we've I know that safety is tricky in Latin America in general, but our experience in Colombia has been extremely difficult. As you know, a lot has happened in the last years in Colombia, and since we are a feminist organization, we started asking ourselves, how can we reinterpret safety? How can we open a debate on safety from different perspectives? I believe that we are all now used to saying that safety is what we are sold as being safety. Protection, driving a car, having a bodyguard, protecting oneself, protecting bodies, right? And this is just not sustainable. We will end up being just protected because a sense of safety and security is not based on participation, but rather on isolating oneself when one is at risk. So we started opening new perspectives, as you said at the beginning, right, Sandra? Human safety or human security is still challenging, isn't it? Because it is still very, well, it's based on idealistic ideas, on the perfect world, and the healthy economy, and the idea of living free from fear and poverty. What does that mean in terms of security? Well, I believe that human security needs to be also interpreted from a feminist perspective. So in this narrative, in this debate, in this nexus between peace and human security, we came to the conclusion that unless we live in a safe world, a democratic world, a participative world, it will be extremely difficult to build peace, because peace is related to human security. There's another element that really inspired us, and this has to do with the Colombian agreement, and it's the polarization of our society. We have always insisted in the idea that even if our agreement is very positive, because it is a milestone, the whole participation of women in the Colombian peace agreement, well, there is nonetheless a major challenge, which is that at the end of the day, it's an agreement between armed actors that reached an agreement. But at the same time, there's a lot of discrimination and social exclusion in Colombia. And as a result of that, many different agendas has emerged, and many of such agendas are competing one with another. So one of the hypotheses that we have is that we need to reach new agreements, new social agreements in several ways. So we need to reach an agreement on human safety. And for that, we need to open a very deep dialogue in Latin America in general and in Colombia in particular. And in this sense, the feminist epistemology has been extremely useful because part of the agreements that we're referring to are women agreement or agreement between men and women, because I believe that change is today extremely disruptive, and as a result of that, we are developing a whole new culture that is based on power relationships and that is also based on the construction of peace building, a different peace, a different definition of peace. So there's peace, there's security, there's mediation as the three pillars to build peace. And this is the feminist approach that I was referring to. Thank you. I came up with two questions that I believe will help framing the topic amongst our audience. On the one hand, I would like to know, well, we understand that safety and security is an experience in which care and protection are key. So it becomes important to transform power relationships. How can we open new dialogues that ease such transformation? On the one hand, this would be the first question. And then I would like to ask you, how would you define the key ingredients of the feminist approach in the framework of this project?
Primero que las y saber que nadie tiene la verdad revelada.
It's important to understand that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all truth. Can you all hear me? You were frozen for a few seconds, but you can go ahead. Well, as I was telling you, there's a first level in this dialogue, which has to do with an open dialogue between feminist and non-feminist organizations, because of course, we are interacting with feminist and non-feminist organizations, and this is a first level of dialogue. And then, of course, there are other forms of dialogue amongst us, but in general, I would say that we believe in a security that places subjectivity at the center, so human experience at the center. And in this sense, we use concepts such as the approach or the perspective in which human beings are at the center of the peace building and safety model. In this sense, it's important to better understand blind spots.
En el caso nuestro, por ejemplo, y creo que también lo vive México y no sé cómo lo vive Cataluña, aquí hay nosotros tenemos unos puntos ciegos muy fuertes que nos los ha permitido.
Here in Colombia, there are important blind spots based on the intersectionality theory. So in this sense, it is important to better understand how discrimination determinants can be understood in human beings to build a more sound peace and security model. And such blind spots also allow us to recognize others. That means what is the experience of others, the subjective experience of others. So we have reinterpreted the concept of peace and security. Of course, this needs to be further developed, and at the end of the day, in the real world, we need to ask ourselves, who am I? How do I understand safety and security? What do I call cool safety? What do I call security? What do I call participation in decision-making processes? What is my definition of peace building, etc.? And this goes beyond nation states, and this goes beyond human security, because human security oftentimes is understood as a form of security. Then it's a wider reading, a wider interpretation than the one that we're giving it. Thank you very much, Rosa Emilia. I believe that now we can broaden the debate and perhaps discussing the different actions that we have implemented in the framework of this joint project. Of course, this has been a progressive project. We have had a lot of open debates and brainstorming exercises, and we have ended up carrying out several workshops. So if you agree, Rosa, Emilia, and Laura, you could tell us a little bit more about the different workshops that have been organized. Well, perhaps we could now give the floor to the Mexican colleagues. Otherwise, you will be fed up of my Colombian accent.
Bueno, yo soy Orfe Castillo, soy de Jazz y somos parte de este proceso.
My name is Orfe Castillo, and as my colleagues said, there's many of us. We are a feminist organization, and we define ourselves as feminist. We aim at enhancing women and women movements through popular education. This has been a key process for us because we believe that the women, peace and security agenda is not developed enough in our countries. We work in Mexico and in Central America, and we're extremely concerned as the majority of this part of the world, because safety and security is a very important topic, even more so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We need more control because there has been a military control here in Latin America, even more importantly in Mexico, and oftentimes there is no room for a more wide reflection about the root causes of the security model. So for us, it is very important to be engaged in this process together with IZIP and the Colombian organizations. So as Rosa Emilia was telling us, we need to take a different scope. We need to better understand that the world is structured on the basis of racism, sexism, that is still lasting today and that is affecting our lives and our countries, and that impose a military-based, an armed-based security model affecting our perception and the relationships that we develop within our communities and when it comes to the development of movements. So yesterday we concluded the last workshop that aims at developing a methodology that will allow us to take a different approach based on security, based on the idea of going to a model that places human beings and resistance experience at the center, not only individual experiences, but also community experiences that are contributing to a different paradigm of relationships between human beings and the environment. We are convinced that this can be one of the solutions to the violence crisis that our countries face. And I would leave it here for now. Thank you very much, Orfe. Elsa, would you like to go next? Thank you. So before you asked us how the workshops had been designed in each specific context. So as it has already been said, the project has forced us to adapt ourselves all the time to different contexts. So the workshops were designed after many different encounters between the CINEP, the CIACE, JAS, and CPAZ. So we spent many mornings discussing also with IZIP, discussing about different topics. So as a result of these meetings, we designed different workshops, and it was a very nice process because each organization could adapt the workshop to their own specific environment, the context. Well, the workshops were split in three, and we invited different groups of participants. We adapted the workshop in Mexico on the basis of the world today in Mexico, the pandemic on the one hand, and the accessibility to remote means, to remote digital tools. The workshops have been designed placing users at the center, and our users are activists, families of victims, and victims of different forms of violence. And the workshop has also been designed placing at the center activists in civil society organizations in different regions of Mexico. And that's it from my side for the time being. I would like to add that it is interesting to reflect about well, we've had to adapt, right, in the context of coronavirus. We had designed more face-to-face interactions, and in the context of the global pandemic, we've had to adapt the workshops to the new reality, and this has had, of course, an impact on the way we have implemented our different methodologies. Would you like to comment on that? Yes, of course. The most important thing has to do with the debate, the discussion regarding adaptability, responding to new realities. And we've opened a debate about this virtual world in which we are now all living. So the core topic was remote connectivity, because of course to move on we had to be online. So we have to work online. At the beginning it was not easy because all the workshops had been designed to be face-to-face. They involved moving around and bringing on board as many stakeholders as possible. And we ended up having to prioritize connectivity, because of course today connectivity is a must. So we invited urban women or women living in rural areas with connectivity. We also adapted as we moved forward and as the pandemic evolved both in Colombia and in Mexico. At the beginning, well, we started organizing workshops in June, July, and ever since things have changed. So at the beginning, we had to adapt to different timings. We had to extend our timings and then shorten them. In the first commission, aimed at defining the methodology, we had to readapt the whole methodology. So between sessions, we had to readapt to each changing reality every day. Time has been extremely important because time is rather limiting in this virtual world. It is a challenge. So we organized 2 hours workshops, and it's not easy to work only in 3 hours. There were 40 participants in each session, so in 3 hours perhaps it would become difficult to tackle all the different topics on the table, in the agenda. So it's not an easy task to allow participation in the virtual format, when there are internet cuts, bad connectivity, etc. The workshops also start at the same time as universities. So in Mexico, internet is collapsed in the morning. So many colleagues, especially those who have sons and daughters at home, well, they would have poor internet connection because everyone was online at home. So, of course, this imposed virtuality has been a topic. So we need to reflect about this new virtual world in which we now live. The digital gap is also a reality that needs to be taken into account. Many of the human rights defenders could not be invited, or we couldn't communicate with them because there were internet problems or connectivity problems. And of course, many of the participants were unfortunately excluded. And then trust. I believe that trust is very important. Trust when it comes to dealing with very difficult topics in a few hours, and also developing sound relationships. It's not easy, right? It was a very nice process, a very nice exchange.
Yo lo dejaría por ahora.
Gracias, Elsa. Pues aprovecho.
Thank you very much, Elsa. I would like to insist on the point you raised, trust building. How would you, colleagues, define the feelings that you had after the workshops? How would you express your feelings regarding the workshops that we organized? Well, I believe that a key part of the process has to do with our clarity of mind. We now know that having a sound dialogue means being flexible and adapting to what we think, right? It is important to focus on common interest based on listening to others, and this is easier said than done. And that's what we have been working on with my colleagues. Many of the human rights defenders hesitate about the possibility of opening a debate with the state. Many of the human rights defenders are not keen on opening a dialogue with men or with perpetrators. And of course, we live amongst a lot of doubts based on this dialogue regarding who we are, but with a clear objective, which is peace building. Thank you, Orfe. Would you like to say anything else? No, not for the time being, thank you. So let's go back to Colombia. Would you like to share your experience from Colombia? I would like to touch on 3 contextual elements that might help framing the situation, especially for those who are not Colombian, so that Rosa can add whatever she considers relevant. I believe that the first important element that needs to be mentioned, because it has to do with our work, and that is that in Colombia we find ourselves in a context of implementation of the peace agreements. It's been quite a long time that the peace agreements were signed between Colombia and the FARC guerrilla, and the peace agreement includes solutions to overcome hot conflicts that had been developed over more than 80 years. And I refer to this point because in the areas where we work in collaboration with IFEP and CINAFE, while we work in pair municipalities, that means that these are municipalities on which these pilot programs are being implemented, precisely because they were especially hit by the armed conflict. So they have experienced a deep impact of the armed conflict. So in these municipalities, there is a high rate of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. And for that, for sure, that is an added challenge to our work with FIAFE and with women. And there's a second element, which is that in the context of human rights violations and violations of humanitarian law, women have had an especially relevant role, which is oftentimes not visible about the forms of violence and conflict that they have been subject to. And that's why with FIACE, we decided that it would be interesting to carry out the project in this region to work with women in urban and rural environments, or only in rural environments, in which the conflict is especially complex and includes other discrimination sources. So we are referring here to women in very difficult context, Afro-Colombian women, rural women, and this adds layers to the discrimination logics that they suffer. So we had to use specific methodologies. In the case of Florida, Valle del Cauca, which is a municipality in the south of Colombia, there had been a previous project implemented with CIAFE, Rosamilia, and I facilitated the dialogue between indigenous communities and farmers' communities. And I refer to this because beyond the more visible conflict in regions, one needs to take into account more subtle forms of conflict, interpersonal conflicts, for example, between different perspectives and identities between indigenous peoples and farmers' organizations that think differently. And for that, you need very specific methodologies adapted to the context. In the case of Rio Sucio in the northeast of Colombia, we have been working with Afro-Colombian women with different leadership positions. This has been a very interesting project from a methodological perspective, because women with whom we work in the framework of this project represent different forms of leadership, different forms of decision-making processes. Some of them are part of boards of directors in their respective organizations, and some forms of leadership are extremely local or infra-local in municipal councils, in community councils, and these women are not necessarily part of decision-making processes. So it's very important to transform subjectivities, because some subjectivities are, let's say, unevenly represented. So the first element I would like to underline has to do with the implementation of the peace agreement in Colombia. It's very clear on paper, right, as Rosa Emilia already mentioned, but the practical implementation of the peace agreements is a challenge indeed. So it is a very difficult implementation, the one we have to impose there. So there are very important dynamics, very important violence dynamics that are difficult to understand. And it's clear that from an international perspective, inequalities are even more enlarged. And violent contacts, of course, impact differently on women. And oftentimes the social inequalities the basis. But then, of course, if you add the fact that many of the women that we work with are Afro-Colombian or farmers, or they have very poor connectivity, this might end up becoming a barrier to participation and end up, very difficult to overcome. Then there's a third element, a third context element, and that is that beyond women are oftentimes amidst violence and armed conflict. Sometimes it's easy to see very important skills amongst women. Many of the women are highly skilled when it comes to developing territorial organizations. For example, in the case of Rio Sucio, the case is very interesting because there are ethnical and territorial organizations that respond to oppression, as it has been said before. They face capitalism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and women oftentimes fight back through different forms of organizations, and they have been extremely powerful when it's come to loving, and they have very interesting dynamics, not only in the area of social mediation, but also when it comes to their interaction with the state. They have developed skills to have an important role as a leader in a quite egalitarian approach. So it's very interesting to underline their capacity to develop and gain agency and their capacity to better organize themselves from grassroots organizations. And for that, they need specific methodologies to respond to the state based on dialogue, based on lobbying, or based on other techniques. So it's very interesting to underline this point. Just for food for thought.
Yo creo que ha sido muy oportuno destacar estos elementos también porque son clave, yo creo, para entender también un poco todo
I think these are key elements to better understand the context in which the project was designed. Rosaia, sorry, off you go. You have the floor. So as Laura said, this is a key point. I would like to underline some of the very interesting points that she has raised, and I'm going to take an exchange approach. I believe that to push forward the agenda amongst different organizations in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Catalonia, I believe that this is a clear bet, a very interesting bet for change. And I believe it's been a challenge for us all. I believe that understanding that, well, I believe that, or I understand that women need to have a specific voice. But the thing is, women's voice has to do, or goes hand in hand with an alternative interpretation, with alternative proposals. And sometimes it's difficult to see, especially in our organizations. And I believe that this has been one of the challenges that we've had to face. Nonetheless, we have been able to open a very wide discussion about the agenda, a very timely agenda in today's world. And I believe that this is one of the scopes that has been developed the most in the last 10 years. Then secondly, we have had an incredible methodological discussion. The possibility to discuss different contexts, Mexico, Colombia, the situation of women, our individual perspectives, has provided us with alternatives, that is, processes to develop new methodology. We have been extremely pleased to be acquainted with the Mexican approach, to have the possibility to travel all the way to Mexico online and understanding that we can use new language methodologies from this perspective. The third point that I believe to be extremely important has to do with this political statement, right? I believe that we are making a clear political statement. Which is we need to take a Latin American approach. A lot has been done in the area of Latin American alliances, and I believe at the end of the day, it's all about getting hands-on and reaching theoretical and practical alliances from a very specific perspective. So, having the possibility to open this discussion, to get on board grassroots organization, rural women, Afro-Colombian women, feminist, non-feminist organizations, and discussing between different perspectives. I believe that this is one of the main points that we need to better understand to come up with a different policy. We need to, as I said before, or as Orphe said before, well, it forces us to think out of the box. To, think out of the box and accept new challenges. Here in Colombia, or at least in the organization that I belong to, called the Action Thought organization, we insist on the fact that in order to ensure that peace is built, we need to think out of the box. We need to get out of our comfort zone, reach other realities, embrace other realities, and open a dialogue with those who we believe to be terrible or evil, right? Of course, we need to ensure safety in this debate. Of course, it is important to take care of ourselves at the same time in the process. That it's about embracing others, it's about embracing otherness, and that's the only possibility to enhance peace building processes. It's all about making the effort to cope with my fear and making an effort and rethinking my positionment. I want to, or we need to understand that we are free to turn back and leave at any given point, but of course this is a major effort. And then this process has also taught us, we've learned a lot in the process, in the Colombian process, about how powerful as women are. I believe that this, of course, needs to be underlined. Women are powerful because when we unite, when we gather, I don't know what Laura thinks, but I believe that we are extremely powerful movement, and also in Latin America. But, you know, we have carried out a joint effort to have an impact on the peace agreements, and this, of course, supposed a very interesting challenge, such as pessimism management, for example, or such as managing untrust or the lack of trust, because we keep insisting on building trust, but let me confess you that oftentimes we have to manage the lack of trust more than trust building, right? We need to better manage the lack of trust, and this, of course, is an art. We need to manage pessimism because, of course, with the situation that we experience today, we need to manage pessimism because it's easy to fall into pessimism oftentimes. But it's important to rethink the process, taking a different approach, putting on the table a different meaning, and we need to open very difficult dialogues. And as women are powerful, and I believe that dialogue for us, well, dialogue is not always easy. This cannot be, I mean, I don't like to generalize, and I don't want to say that women are all terrific. No, that's not what I'm saying. But at the same time, then there is another element that we need to better reflect upon, and that is that dialogue oftentimes becomes easier when we find ourselves in crazy and subjective environments, and this oftentimes allows structural change, very interesting structural change processes. And I believe that this joint effort, this joint exercise that hopefully will bring on board new countries and new stakeholders in the future, because in the framework of this project, we are also interacting with youth organizations, and these girls are amazing, women between 16 and 21 years old, and they are just amazing. They're extremely powerful.
Pues yo he sido, la verdad, muy potente. ¿Aló?
Sí, Rosa Emilia, perdona, que es que las últimas frases a mí particularmente se me...
Rosa Emilia, you were frozen in the last few sentences. I don't know if you were done. Yeah, I was just saying that all the interaction between different layers.
De este diálogo ha sido muy potente y al menos nosotras estamos muy felices y puede ser una cosa estratégica.
We're extremely pleased.
Gracias, Rosa Emilia. Yo ahora
Thank you, Rosa Emilia.
Nosotras porque estamos muy familiarizadas, ¿no? En lo que
We are
involucra todo este proyecto,
very much acquainted
los objetivos, el sentido a nivel más estratégico,
with the project and the framework, the theoretical framework.
También me pregunto si las personas que nos están escuchando también les gustaría saber.
I would like to know if our audience would like to have a specific example about the different actions that have been implemented in the framework of the workshops. At the end of the day, it's a methodology which is pretty different.
Y no sé si alguna de vosotras pues quisiera explicar un poco cómo se ha desarrollado, ¿no? Los talleres.
Would you like to touch on this point about how the workshops have been implemented from a more practical perspective and putting examples about how women in each different group responded to the different suggested activities? Thank you. Well, I would like to say that an important element in the process, and Rosai also mentioned it, has to do with trust building. We are working, well, we're part of different processes, and we're not working with colleagues. This wasn't an open call. This is part of projects that had already been developed. And I believe that this is extremely important. Trust building is delicate. And it's very important that as human rights defenders work on the topic because it's a very invisible area. And I would like to insist on this point because oftentimes many of the exercises that we have carried out in the framework of the workshop, and Elsa can tell you more about the methodology, and oftentimes we exchanged perspective about our childhood, and we implemented exercises so that others could look at us from a more holistic perspective and not only saying who we are from an organizational perspective, but rather who we are about our whole integrity. As women, human rights defenders, we also carried out exercises to trying to better understand our blind spots. That is, what don't I see from my perspective because I have blind spots. So I believe that urban human rights defenders have a different experience about the commons if we compare our experience with more rural women who live in more community-based societies where human bond is an integral part of their lives. And I believe that this is key. Ilsa, would you like to say anything about this point or about any of the exercises that we were being asked about? Absolutely. So we also did a quiz about different methodologies to be implemented. And as Orphe said before, the first part had to do with getting to recognize others, getting to know each other from different perspectives, from different exercises, instead of saying, hello, my name is Elsa and I work in CPAZ, right? So what do I eat? Where do I live? What are the sounds that I listen on a daily basis? What are the smells that I live around, etc. So we also carried out exercises to better understand our bodies, relaxation exercises,
Y luego ya en la parte de los más temática hacemos una mezcla entre a veces
and then there was also a theoretical part and an exercise that allows a reflection about each topic, and then a plenary discussion, a group discussion, a pairs discussion, so that in groups everyone could speak and respect others who don't like to take the floor in plenary sessions and who rather speak in petit comité. And then we also reflected about how to carry out a presentation, a public presentation. We counted on the participation of Rosa in a session. We also invited her to tell us more about Colombia and to build networks. We also script a clip on session. Our colleague would share also a relaxation exercise with us. And we also used different tools. For example, tools to carry out different exercises. One of the tools was called, well, basically, we'll send a link to them. It was like a blackboard where everyone can answer to a quiz. So that's another tool that we used. This was a methodology that we used, and then there was a closing session.
Dependía un poco cómo veíamos el grupo, si tenía acceso a una laptop o una computadora, más bien si estaban en el celular, pues lo hacíamos más platicado, ¿no? Y nosotras, o nos iban enviando sus respuestas también por...
So we used a combination of tools.
Rellenando en el documento común o por el mismo chat de Zoom también nos iban...
We also used the Zoom chat and many others, and I believe that these were the main tools that we used. Thank you. Thank you, Elsa.
¿Queréis añadir algún
Laura or Rosa Emilia, would you like to add any other example or any other action that was implemented in this sense? Yeah, sure. I would like to add 2 points here. The first one has to do with the fact that the workshop was organized around different topics. For example, in the case of Colombia with CPAZ, with Rosa Emilia, we wanted to open a debate around 4 topics, 4 key topics. The first one was the different definitions of security and the positioning of participants regarding security, and then we connected the topic a more territorial perspective. The case of Ria Sucia, the regional international city, is oftentimes built on the basis of different women living in different communities and in different leadership levels. So we decided to start understanding the dynamics and the security conceptions, subjective security conceptions, to orient the whole thing towards a more territorial perspective, because it's very interesting to combine different approaches and different scopes and different effects for subjectivity, adopting also a more territorial approach. So, how was all this combined to tackle individual safety and a more territorial approach of security? And after that, we also made the link with 2 other sessions on different strategies to enhance peace. And there, mediation took a very important role. It's all about understanding the different dialogue strategies, different community-based mediation processes, and understanding that as an option to have an impact on the context of insecurity and risk in which women live. And we related that with a more broad discussion about peace building to better understand the 4 different pillars or the 4 different topics, the parting points for the analysis that we aim to carry out. And this also involved a reflection process. Of course, now we need to better reflect about how to work online, because of course topics are very sensitive, and even though if we are in the context of a peace agreement implementation, there's still violence and armed conflict going on in Colombia. So some people might sneeze into our workshops and we don't know it. Just to give you an example, many women, many participants, oftentimes they have their bodyguards or safety, bodyguards that are not necessarily part of the process, and this is an added challenge that is sometimes difficult to manage, and that's why oftentimes the methodology that we use or that we think about has to do with identifying different forms of violence and different forms of insecurity that women experience without placing them at risk. So we need to find a balance between being open and at the same time preserving safety. For our participants, yes, I would like to add a point here, and I would like to take a perspective which is based on the virtual world in which we interact today. What Elsa was saying is key. In the world that we live in today, in this 100% virtual context, the digital gap, the digital divide is a major challenge that we have had to tackle, and even more so when you work with women, because oftentimes we can come to the conclusion that in the case of women, the digital gap is even wider than amongst men. So this has been very complex to deal with. We've had to use WhatsApp and different forms of digital communication, but at the same time, it's been an extremely interesting process because, you know, all challenges come up with an opportunity, and there's been an important ownership process led by women. Many of the women have learned a lot about technology and technology management and how women are little by little gaining ownership about technology. And I believe that the discussion about technology is on the table, and it needs to be better understood as, you know, the digital world is a world in which we need to better understand the tools for a greater participation and a greater inclusion of women in these discussions. And of course, this has been an unexpected positive outcome of this very interesting process that we have been immersed in. Furthermore, there's this massive connectivity possibility. When the Mexican colleagues invited us to the meeting in Mexico, I was thrilled. I was thrilled because I thought, wow, I thought that I was traveling all the way to Mexico online. This gave me the possibility to have access to women from Mexico. If I had had to travel, it would not have been possible necessarily. So for me, it was very interesting. It was very emotional, actually. And, you know, it was very interesting to see the possibility to keep interacting in the future online. And also, many women are developing digital skills that will enhance their self-sufficiency. And I believe that women's autonomy is key. When we are discussing here about subjectivity, we're not discussing only about subjectivity per se, but rather about the subjectivity that is wider and wider as women can, as any stakeholder, have better skills and transform difficult situations, oppression, and violence, and a context of lack of participation that does not allow women to participate actively and, let's say, have an open and active role. Well, it's important to see how these digital skills contribute to widening the scope. And in this sense, it is extremely, or at least here in Colombia, for us, it's very interesting to see how women develop skills and how women develop new ways of taking care of each other. In this sense, I would like to insist on the topic of care. A key element for security has to do with care, with the care world, with the care economy. And oftentimes, when it comes to care, we still lack awareness. But women, when they have time to, especially women from popular backgrounds that have to work all day long, they don't have enough free time to reflect about their needs and their priorities. And in a sense, it's incredible to see how care gains a very important role, because being aware about self-care is key for better understanding that I deserve a safe environment. And this might seem unrelated to the topic at hand, but if I don't believe that I am entitled to safety, it will be very difficult for me to understand that I deserve an integral security of my human condition. So, in the methodology that we use, there have been important expressions of women when they have time to take care of themselves, to put some body lotion, to give themselves a short little massage. At the beginning, it's weird, but they feel dignified after having time for doing that. And I believe that these minor details, these theoretically minor details, these blind spots might look not important, but are important, very important indeed, in the active construction of safety environments. So I believe that in this sense, it's important to acknowledging others from this perspective. And then there's a third point that I would like to raise. I believe that different organizations, we coincide in this point, and I believe that this knowledge dialogue is very important. It's very important that urban women, liberal professionals understand that we are not in a top-down approach. It is important to have a cross-cutting approach. We need to acknowledge each other and each other knowledge, because all knowledge, all experience are very important. So I believe that, Orfe, Laura, we all agree that this open dialogue, this open dialogue of knowledge between women has a very interesting impact, which is, as much as me about what's out there and what happens out there in the world. So it's you and only you, the main character of your own life and your own definition of safety and the possible solutions to build a safe environment, and also for contributing to peace building in the context of your world, right? Of your own individual context. So in this sense, it's very important to better understand these blind spots theory and to carry out this intersectional exercise on women and on knowledge that women treasure, because this is a key point. And I believe also that there are some elements that have been very useful in the workshops and that have been extremely useful to ensure that the dialogue is, a deep dialogue that goes beyond only acknowledging each other, but also acknowledging each other's knowledge. Thank you very much to all of you. I believe that you raised a very interesting point, Rosa Emilia, a very interesting point. In the process, we have had an open debate about the importance to take into account self-protection, because it is also true that we have different perspectives, yeah, about many points. So I don't know if you could perhaps touch on this thing, on this point about this holistic perspective before the process and after the process. So has your perspective changed throughout the process? Thank you. Orfe, go ahead. Well, we have, in the region, we have been able to we have implemented a very holistic perspective, placing self-care and mutual care at the center. And this was a key element. The murder of Berta Cáceres was key, and unfortunately, we had to rethink about the different strategies that we were using. So it's very clear today, and communities have taught us that the community-based safety model is the only sustainable one to ensure the sustainability of our movements. This has to be the answer. Here is where the true security lays, and that's why our ancestral peoples still exist today. Also, for Jazz, it's very important, right, to be here. We've had a very open dialogue with CPAZ. CPAZ is a pioneer organization in peace building and mediation building in Mexico. This is a very important referent that aimed at reinforcing the feminist perspective, and for us it was key to make the link between both points and better understanding how this relates to safety, security, to the definition of risk and punishment. But of course, if we take a feminist analysis, we need to acknowledge that this vision of safety and security also affects us. So for me, it's been very important, this radical dialogue, right, which is thinking about the relationship between impossible dialogues, I would say impossible dialogues, which is this point in which women defenders, human rights defenders interact with police officers. This seems impossible, but it has happened now in Mexico for many human rights activists. It's very difficult to open this sort of dialogues. So this radical dialogue, this acknowledgement of the other, if you bring it to what really has an impact on your everyday life, would have or would make us at least look at others. I don't know if it's feasible to open a dialogue with certain stakeholders. Many of the human rights defenders that I have interacted with told me no way. Others have to do it because they live together with them, they coexist hand in hand with them. But of course, there are many, many questions on the table about what this means in terms of security for women and women communities. So sometimes human rights defenders don't have the possibility to represent or to Sometimes women bear a burden in terms of security, such as dealing with the security department of their communities. And this, of course, is very difficult and very exhausting. So the process is only at the beginning. We need to open a wider dialogue altogether to provide you with more feedback. To anyone who's interested in the experience, I would say, as many of my colleagues already said, to close this intervention, that we are now convinced that dialogue between different women and between movements is key to broaden the scope, the imagination horizon to the violence and conflict reality in which we're all immersed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Orfe. I'm always emotional when I listen to you. You are so transparent and straightforward. It's all about enhancing dialogue, and it's all about ensuring that dialogue is. So Laura was also mentioning the importance to act without harming. Maybe your aims are noble, but in the process, there are important negative externalities for women. So if you had to underline what element do you use to ensure that your actions are harmless, which one would you underline? Is it my turn? Yes, Laura, please go ahead. Or were you asking my colleague? Well, actually, there are several elements. Some of them have already been underlined by my colleagues. And I believe that it's nonetheless important to underline them. Orfe was pointing at the importance of trust, and I believe that one of the key elements to ensure action with no harm has to do with the trust building processes and trust between communities and us. And then all the exercises, systematization processes, etc., well, they are all carried out on the base, took hand in hand with communities, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that know the environment, and they are the ones that better know the different stakeholders. And I believe that one of the key processes to ensure that there's no harm is the recognition of the diversity of knowledge. And I believe that in the CNEP, that's the idea that has always inspired us to open this dialogue in Rio Sucio, not only with women, but also with the different leaders of the community. We enabled the process in my team, the mediation team, thanks to our 13 years experience in the field and the trust that this entails. So I believe that acknowledging others is key, right? Indeed, because they then trust us when it comes to lobbying actions. So some regions, for some reason, don't have the capacity to reach national or international entities, and for them, this is a trust process in which they really pay attention to our leadership. Let me give you an example about a specific example of a dialogue with an environmental institution. At a given moment in the meeting, we opened a debate between an organization that was assessing an environmental organization in Colombia. Well, they didn't want us there, and they asked us to leave the process, but we wanted to be there, we wanted to be present to ensure that there was a certain balance between different actors in the negotiation. So I believe that this is a two sides coin. It's a bilateral process in the sense that they also contribute to widening trust amongst us all. Then there is a second element that is also important to ensure no harm action, which has to do with the acknowledgement of different strategies. In the sense, I like to say that even if I am the coordinator of the mediation team, mediation is not always the best option. When it's not possible, when asymmetry is very wide, you don't need to fall into the trap. You can't legitimize certain practices that we don't agree with. So legitimizing a debate between or with a government with no guarantees to ensure that the exercise is fully participatory and based on a narrative, a sound narrative, and that also express themselves in a specific social transformation change. Without these conditions, I believe that this is an empty dialogue. So I believe that part of no harm action has to do with understanding that there are different strategies to ensure, well, this is a very different exercise to overcome historic differences, especially when you interact with violent government. And I believe that this is a very interesting exercise. Nonetheless, it needs to be better understood. Also understanding that there are different strategies such as social mobilization and different strategies that combine to be able to carry out social transformation processes.
Gracias, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
Emilia, ¿querías apuntar alguna?
Rose Emilia, would you like to point at anything else? Yeah, I believe that this is a very complex topic. I agree with what has been said in the sense that dialogue is not always easy. And more importantly, when it's about opening a dialogue, well, when there's no trust, dialogue is very difficult. And we came up with a methodology that is called New Possible Dialogues. And they are also called impossible dialogues or unlikely dialogues. So we imposed ourselves the challenge to open a dialogue with the military forces in Colombia and with the police. And this was difficult, very difficult, but it's been also an important learning. From the Nosotras group, we reached an agreement on ethics for peace. And in this sense, we need to speak about a very difficult relationship with different police departments in general in Latin America as a whole. But in this exchange that perhaps is a little bit longer here, point number 5 of the agreement refers to safety and security based on human rights and from a holistic perspective. So this point number 5 is a result of a debate with women police officers, because of course it was our goal, right? But there's only us. There are different angles. There's a lot of difference, and I believe this is another major challenge when you want to build new societies, but there's always the same on the table. It's very difficult to see others' blind spots or for them to see our position and understand our position. So we organized discussion breakfasts, and there were very difficult moments, all forms and types of moments. But in this sense, let me share an example with you. In one of the first breakfasts that we organized, there was a wide representation of women, and also sometimes we had 2 or 3 men in the room. And as the process evolved, the very same men, the very same police officers would tell us we would never be as transparent as you are. The debate that you are having here, we don't have it as men, don't interact so freely. And we didn't even know. We were not even aware of how free we were speaking. So at a given point, we engaged in an exercise and we started using drawings to define others. And of course, the drawings were amazing, or rather horrible. Police officers had a terrible perspective of us, but the perspective they had about us was very interesting because they really stigmatize us. It's quite horrible to conclude this, right? So there is a key element, which is that sometimes we speak about stigma, prejudice, and many other points. And this, of course, was useful to open a more in-depth debate about this impossible dialogue and also allowed for the process to move forward until we reached a point in which we could start interacting, engaging in terms of what all this change would mean in terms of changes in the police department. And we could also open a dialogue with them, with UNIPEP, which is peace promotion, peace department. And this has been a very interesting process. And in a certain way, one could say that it is key. But what I want to say by that is that, well, all this debate was possible, of course, and unfortunately, in the context today, we had to stop it, right? And that's what Laura mentions. Some contexts are easier than others, and in this moment, we are engaged in a very interesting debate with the police, but not with the military. And in this sense, I believe we need to open a discussion about the definition of security amongst feminist organizations. What is the anti-military scope and perspective about peace, etc., which is intermingled with the previous, right? Some women are not even aware of what the military thinks about feminist organizations. And I believe that what we aim at doing is saying, well, any narrative has to be accepted. I mean, all narratives are valid, right? And what's also important to say is that we need to better or we need to think about how we can find or how we can get rid of the different masks that we all carry. I have experienced this in myself, in my own body. How can we also ensure that we get rid of our masks? Because, for example, I have some friends in the police department in Colombia, and they are amazing. They have taught me a lot. They are just amazing human beings. And they are police officers, and this, of course, has been an important lesson for me. Of course, I'm not generalizing here, but this opens the door to new questions and new elements and to new points and to new reflections. It applies to religious women and women that are extremely different from us. Thank you, Rosa Emilia. Well, this debate is extremely interesting. As I said before, all narratives and all opinions are valid, and we need to get rid of our masks to ensure dialogue. One of the major strengths that cross us are colonialism, or is rather colonialism, extractivism, extractivist capitalism. So what perspective do you take about this, about the colonization process? I think it's interesting to reflect about decolonialization. I don't know if Rosa Emilia would like to touch on this point. Orfe has a very interesting perspective on this. Perhaps I can share an introduction, but please, I would like to ask my colleagues to also engage. My perspective about colonialism places me in a place where, you know, from a feminist perspective, colonialism imposes a major challenge, as Laura was saying before. The patriarchal system, the capitalist model. So for me, colonialism is not territorial colonialism anymore. It's not about territorial colonialism anymore. Latin America is reforging its identity. I believe that finally we are in the path to rebuild our identity from a more interesting perspective. In Colombia, identity is key today, and we are an Afro-descendant country, we are an indigenous country, we are a Métis country with a wide range of variety, white, mulatto, etc. And this is extremely rich, and we are finding and defining our own identity, and this is one of the dimensions I would like to refer to. But at the same time, when we speak about decolonialization, we're speaking about decolonialization here. And when we're speaking about decolonialization there, I believe that the North-South divide changes radically. And that's because some people in the North are 100% decolonialists, whereas in the South, some people are 100% colonialists. So there, I believe that things have changed in this sense. Some people speak about decolonialization as this permanent fight between white and white supremacism. And I believe sometimes it's confusing in the sense that well, we all have the right to live free from patriarchal models. And at the same time, I believe that in this sense, it's all about decolonializing our soul from so many oppressions that we have experienced for so many years. We need to act freely, and please, Laura Orfe, tell us more about it. Well, I'm totally fascinated by this decolonialist approach that structures our societies. And I believe that there is a clear relationship between the protection of our security and this model based on a structural deposition model. In Sapul, Sarko, the communities that were harmed, and this thankfully ended in historic trial of the women in the area started due to the aim of recovering the land by local communities in Mexico. The last reforms of the security system is a result of the concessions to multinational companies so that they can keep enriching themselves endlessly. So these are absolutely impossible relationships. And I believe that there is no possibility to have this conception of security, which does not go hand in hand with racist extractivist capitalism that penetrates our societies and the world as a whole, as patriarchy that colonializes us all. And I would like to dig into a conversation that we're having before. She said before that in these panel discussions we've been discussing about the contribution of many feminists that are unnoticed, and that's the problem. We don't look at each other. And this has to do with the fact that sometimes we only give importance to what's from far away, and we need to rethink the experiences, our own learnings, and the words of the women that from theory and practice are building incredible things. And here I would like to say something else about the process in our workshops. Lolita Chavez from Mexico, from Guatemala, Francesca Gargallo from Italy. They are only a few examples of the long list of anonymous persons that today are fighting against racism and extractivism through dialogue, through a sound dialogue regarding who is in front of us. So thank you, or I believe this is a shared challenge, because even here, when we try to read and find other references, we end up having a very endogamic approach, and we need to question that. We need to listen to other voices. So here I would like to thank you all for your contributions. We have raised a lot of very interesting points. Now we have 20 minutes left only. Why don't we open for Q&A now? Because we have a wide audience and I would like to give them the floor. So, thank you very much for giving us the possibility to share thoughts and perspective. Elsa Cecian says, we know that you are in Mexico due to the tamales in your wall. Now regarding the different questions we have here, the first one is for all of you. Before we've discussed about territoriality. So this concept, right? About the place where we live about, or when you refer to the region, you refer also to other contexts, such as the school. And I think that this is important. Would you like to make any comment? Otherwise, we'll go to the next. Absolutely. Of course, communities are not based to geographical regions. I believe that the school is also a very important community in which we need to rethink security and invisible violences, etc. And I believe that this is extremely patriarchal and racist. I would like to hack virtually Malu Valenzuela. She's a pioneer on peace building from Mexico. And that's another of the actors that we need to learn from. Thank you very much. So the thing is how to integrate invisible violence, right? Because if they are not visible, how can we draw a line in a sense?
quien quiera puede responder porque no es una pregunta en concreto.
Any of you can answer.
Perdón,
It's
¿puede
not a
repetir?
specific question. Could you please
No, sí,
repeat the question? Sure.
comentaban por el chat, ¿no? En relación
It
a
has
lo
been said
que
before in the chat. Before we were, or we raised another point, and now the next question is, what happens with invisible violence? How can we integrate or draw a line to combat this invisible violence? Would be the first challenge. Well, that's extremely interesting, isn't it? That's the interesting thing about the blind spot concept. How can we raise awareness and how can we ensure the visibility of these blind spots? And I believe that in this sense, there is an important substantial contribution that has to be somehow developed through or by feminism. What we define as public or private has a lot of blind spots for those who are or who have their own different experience. And in a sense, I believe that there's a school, there's, all the different forums that we call territories where life happens. So when we discuss about the situation of girls in the school, we have been capable of raising awareness about harassment at school or the violence that is happening and that is, let's say, less and less visible. And this is a result of the girls' experience or harassment against or discrimination against trans people or people with other gender subjectivities. So I believe that the possibility to share the experience of women, well, this shows the blind spots that are key for security. And I would like to say also that when we speak about security, we are transforming, we're also transforming the mandates, the roles, the cultural roles that make this insecurities permanent. So what happens here? There's a deep transformation led by feminism. I would like to say here that oftentimes the feminist narrative is understood as violent because they are attacking men. So we need to raise awareness about blind spots here. We need to change society. Not only for women to live better, and to change the way we interact. Now I'm not referring here to identities, but rather to other forms of interacting from diversity about what freedom means. Yes, let's link this with the next question. What is the key point to ensure feminist empowerment? Elsa, would you like to respond?
No sé si hay una ABC. Así como...
I'm not sure there's like an A, B, C. There's no... I mean, I believe that
un pequeño cambio a la palabra. El reto que tuvimos no es tanto tener una mirada integral.
The challenge we experience sometimes is not so much, it's about having an integrative perspective Because what gathered us here and the challenge that we face here is, well, first of all, to understand things from our blind spots, as we always say recently. It's so trendy today.
El ser mujer, ¿no? En nuestros contextos, pero también cómo cada una veía, entendía la paz, ¿no? Sin, o sea,
It's about having our own definition of peace, isn't it? First of all, we need to agree on this definition. How do we interpret security and protection?
Fue un espacio de intercambio, yo diría. Fue como un primer espacio, al menos hablo entre México, para conocernos entre nosotras, para crear.
It's about getting to know each other, to build trust, and to better understand.
Y luego poder como ver si de ahí, desde nuestras vivencias, podíamos ahí sí.
It's about understanding if, from our perspective, we can start, I don't know, a new project. And that's the main challenge that we imposed on ourselves, right? So we shared these exchanges about words that sometimes we believe. We came to the conclusion that we don't sometimes share the definitions, and that's quite rich. Sometimes we had our own presentation. We all understand things differently. And this brought us to a very different perspective, right? And this allowed us to understand, to better understand women's needs. And of course,
pase algo en la tarde y el día siguiente quiero hablar de otra cosa o me genera como otras ideas. Entonces, sí, más que un abecedario, lo que buscamos en estas semanas y en estos meses fue un intercambio y más bien yo lo plantearía como el reto para lo que sigue de qué es lo que queremos construir y si incluso si nos interesa tener este abecedario o más bien como seguir la reflexión.
So it's about understanding whether we want to have this ABC or open a rather wide discussion, right? So I think you've summarized it perfectly, right? I share it 100%. Sometimes we feel safer in static positions.
Precisamente el enriquecimiento está en este cuestionamiento continuo y en un aprendizaje constante, ¿no? De que tú misma...
So perhaps it's all about long life learning, right?
Y que en el intercambio pues está realmente el empoderamiento, ¿no?
So it's all about empowerment, isn't it? So if you agree, we'll move to the next session for Rosa. It's a very specific question. And the question is, I would like to know, how do you describe peace from a gender perspective? If you had to describe peace from a gender perspective, what would you say? Peace based on democracy and freedom. This is what that would be. I believe that for me, the gender perspective is a tool. And my position and my political position is the main contribution of feminism A gender that takes diversity into account has to do with understanding
y que implican todos los temas de racialización, todos los temas, toda la interseccionalidad étnica, todo, digamos, el sujeto en su conjunto y que son invisibles. Entonces, cuando hablamos de democracia, nos dirigimos.
So when we speak about democracy,
Yo creo que nosotras,
this is a very deep concept.
no haya ciudadanías plenas, por ponerle ese nombre que es más usual ahorita, unas ciudadanías construidas desde lo indígena.
So citizenship needs to be built from an Afro perspective, from a farmer perspective, from a very deep perspective. So in this case, democracy doesn't work. Democracy as a system doesn't work unless it includes a wide perspective. So it's all about radical democracy. And radical means deep, real. And in this sense, it should also be free. And this is serious, right? It's all about how do I manage my own freedom. Thanks, Rosa Emilia. Indeed, sometimes we use it in a very superficial way, and it cannot be done this way. So in the chat, there's a message here. Thank you very much for sharing your learnings. We have only 5 minutes left before we have to close the session. Would you like to add one last comment, one last burning comment to close the session, before we close the session? Silence is also allowed. Thank you very much for this nice silence. Well, I would like to say 5 words. I would like to share 5 words. I would like to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Laura Quintana, who speaks about the importance of everyday life practices for emancipation. For me, the project has been the perfect opportunity to raise awareness about everyday life practices
cambios estructurales, porque eso también es digamos, de largo aliento y de largo plazo, y por eso también la apuesta de continuar este proyecto y de continuar una alianza que pues Rosa Emilia ha venido impulsando muchísimo, pero también tener un poco como de esperanza en
and at
esos
the same time,
pequeños cambios y en la importancia de, como nos decía,
it's all about small changes
de cómo los pequeños cambios iban cambiando realidades, y yo creo que parte de
and about a small change, yeah.
cada una de las mujeres que pasan por este proyecto y que ojalá, digamos, se unan y nos unamos también a ellas en esta...
It's about uniting one another in this long-term project for women's emancipation and to take a South-South perspective also. And it's also about understanding the territory, the region, not as a geographical perspective, but from an epistemologic perspective, including change in our Latin American realities, and more in particular in this Colombian reality. And I would like to also thank you all for those who participated and those who didn't, because silence also matters, as you said, and silence is also transformational. And I believe that here we need to open a reflection, and there's a lot to be said, which has to do regarding the methods or methodologies that are not understood as contra-hegemonic, such as silenced practices from shyness that women express sometimes through silence, which are not visible, but that change reality. So that's why I would like to thank the team, Catalina Serrano, and Maria Fernando, who are from the team, but who are not here. And for the fact that they are not here, it doesn't mean that they are not visible. and that they haven't participated in this joint effort. Thank you very much.
A mí me parece. No, dale, Rosae. Dale, Rosae. No, yo
There's,
también quería como cerrar un poquito,
to conclude,
pero mi agradecimiento va a ser un
I would
poco
like
más.
to thank you all.
Yo quiero agradecer
I want to
de
thank
México con todo
my colleagues from Mexico from the bottom of my heart, because we have.
es decir, y sus organizaciones. Entonces yo creo que es hermosísimo este proceso porque además en este proceso también ha crecido el afecto entre nosotras y ha sido realmente muy bonita. Ha sido una conversación diferente. Agradecerle a Lizzie por también haberse metido en este.
So thanks to the ISIP for being
y una contribución y
part of the process, and thanks to my colleagues. With Laura, we have been working for a long time,
haber considerado que esto
and also it's very important to understand that this was an important bet, and I would like to also insist that Laura mentioned a very interesting point, and I would like to also make it extensive to the team that has been working.
Muy complejo. Entonces, a Diana García, a Juliana Suescún, a Andrea, a Karen, a todas las que no están aquí, que son invisibles, gracias Laura por haber hecho eso, y que han contribuido increíblemente a las compañeras de las regiones, a las chicas jóvenes que han estado participando, a las mujeres indígenas, a todas. Este es un proceso realmente de un diálogo muy particular y muy único y a finales de este mes, al parecer vamos a tener ya un diálogo donde vamos a estar todos los diversos niveles, desde las mujeres locales como las otras, y esta es una apuesta que vamos a seguir, y a la Ibero, por supuesto, por habernos dado este espacio de compartir. Entonces, muchísimas gracias y ojalá podamos seducir a más organizaciones feministas y no feministas en buscarnos caminos, en desafiarnos para que siempre sea la posibilidad de la creatividad la que nos vaya abriendo los caminos, y me pareció divina esa propuesta de aprendizaje sin recetas. Extraordinaria esa frase. Muchas gracias. Entonces, Orfe, su merced linda.
Pues yo quiero cerrar como revalorando y pidiéndole a todas que sigamos pensando en el valor de los encuentros entre distintas. Creo que es una práctica muy, muy enriquecedora, para nosotras lo ha sido, y que podamos también seguir siempre valorando, mirando y acompañando los aportes de las defensoras de la tierra y el territorio, de las comunidades que luchan por su autonomía, de los colectivos que buscan a sus familiares desaparecidos, de las mujeres que acompañan a otras mujeres que viven violencia, de las defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos en nuestra región que se siguen resistiendo a que la indignación y el enojo se quede ahí y están construyendo el tejido social tan caro a este continente. Estoy muy contenta de haber podido compartir el espacio y, como dice Rosa Emilia, ojalá que podamos tener más gente sumada a esta intención. Un abrazo para todas. Gracias por estar. Chao.
Pues me sumo a nombrar a las personas, no le voy a decir invisible porque no lo fue para nada, pero este proceso lo he trabajado con mi compañera Diana Lepe. Ella justamente está ahorita en Chiapas en otros procesos, y me tocó a mí acompañarlas hoy para presentar. Pero pues sí, agradecer a Diana que me ha acompañado en ese proceso, a Jazz por siempre ponernos como la mirada feminista y nunca quitar el dedo de renglón. Y claro que a las compañeras del CIACE, del CINEP, también por invitarnos a este proceso, al ISIP. Y pues por ahí nos veremos, nos seguiremos viendo para también el año que viene, a ver si logramos una receta o no.
Pues muchas gracias a todas por vuestras siempre excelentes reflexiones. Es un privilegio siempre escucharos. Seguiremos, seguro, porque todavía nos queda mucho por hacer y también deshacer. Y a todas y todos vosotros que desde diferentes rincones nos habéis estado acompañando, también muchísimas gracias. Aprovecharía rápidamente la ocasión para invitarles a un ciclo de webinars que iniciamos mañana y que organizamos desde el ISIP junto con otras organizaciones sobre la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad, donde reflexionaremos también sobre si se está logrando realmente una agenda transformadora tras 20 años desde su adopción. También debatiremos sobre la necesidad de poner el peso del rol de las mujeres como agentes de cambio y no solo como víctimas. Y nos preguntaremos sobre dónde queda la noción de seguridad en esta agenda. Para acompañarnos en estas sesiones, simplemente os recomiendo que sigáis al ISIP en redes, tanto en Facebook como en Twitter, y así podréis acceder a los enlaces. Traslado esta invitación a mis compañeras porque ya también las echo de menos después de procesos intensos, pues si podemos estar todas juntas en estas sesiones será estupendo. Y sea como sea, esperamos seguir compartiendo globalmente, tejer red, que es donde reside el mayor potencial de cambio, al fin y al cabo. Y deseamos que a pesar de todas las dificultades actuales, todas estéis bien y sobre todo cuídense mucho y hasta muy pronto. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Sandra. Entonces, ahora, bueno, queremos agradecer muchísimo al ISIP y sobre todo también a ti por apoyarnos en la organización de este panel. Agradecer también muchísimo a Rosa, a Laura, a Orfe y a Elsa. En este conversatorio tan importante que se ha organizado, sin duda han quedado muchas provocaciones también en el público y sabemos que la conversación va a seguir al menos durante los siguientes días y ya esperemos que pueda continuar en el futuro. También al público asistente queremos comentarles que esa tarde continuamos con el Congreso, con el panel 5, las emociones en la seguridad, organizado por el CPAZ de Colombia, a las 4 de la tarde, hoy un poco más tarde, y el día de mañana tenemos un conversatorio de educación, familias y paz, organizado por la Cátedra UNESCO, a las 9 de la mañana, y después tenemos el panel 6 de 1 a 3, que trata sobre experiencias y reflexiones sobre construcción de paz en contextos académico y universitario, organizado por CIES Jesuitas por la Paz, y el panel 7 también, que es construcción de paz transformativa, justicia restaurativa, la intersección entre género, raza y trauma, a las 4 de la tarde, organizado por el Centro para la Justicia y la Construcción de Paz de la Eastern Munich University. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos y nos estaremos viendo un poco más tarde. Que tengan buena tarde.
Igualmente, hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.